Once, I was driving through the Canadian Rockies late at night and had just passed through a small town. I was driving through the pitch black when I needed to stop to pee and have a smoke. But because it was so dark, I missed the last rest stop, but no problem. The highway was completely deserted. So, I pulled to the side of the road, had my pee while staring out into the dark, then lit up a cigarette and stood by my car. As I was standing there, I saw the figure of a man walking out of the tree line. I was miles from civilization, had patchy cell service, and there wasn't a soul on the road. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe it was a deer. But nope, this was a man. I calmly walked back to the driver's door, got in, and locked the doors behind me. I kept my eye on this guy as I nervously smoked, with my car in drive, ready to peel out, but for some reason, I just stayed put. The guy walked right up to my passenger door and knocked on the window. I cracked the window and asked what was up. He replied in a very serious tone, "I need you to call the cops." I cautiously asked why, and he told me he had gone out into the woods to kill himself but couldn't go through with it because he thought of his daughters right before he was about to do it. I called the cops while the guy quietly cried outside. He had a kitchen knife that he was going to use on himself, so I stayed in the car and advised him to maybe leave the knife on the ground before the cops arrived. The cops came and got him, but before they left with him, I had a heartfelt conversation with him and wished him well. I still think about him. I hope he was able to turn things around. Well, it was creepy at first. I pulled into a Purdue plant, dropped my empty trailer, and parked where they allow bobtails to sit, right next to a nice little pond. My pickup was in 12 hours, so I did my PTI and lay down in the bunk. At about 3 a.m., I heard something tapping on my passenger side door. I got up, looked out the window expecting to see someone, maybe a driver asking for a lumper check, but no one was there. All right, maybe I'm hearing things. So I lay back down. As soon as my head hit the pillow, I heard the tapping again, except this time it was on my driver's side. Same thing as before. I jumped up, looked out my window, but nothing was there. I double-locked my doors just in case and opened my side hatches so I could hear what was going on outside. After about 15 minutes, I heard a very light splat, splat, splat along the driver's side of the truck. I slowly got up, planning to look out my window at the exact moment whoever knocked on my door. Then I heard a thud coming from the roof of the cab. I stopped, grabbed my tire thumper off its hook, and readied myself for whatever the hell was going on. Then a motherfucking goose fell off the top of the truck and landed on my hood. It stood up, waddled back and forth, and looked at me. As we made eye contact, the tapping at my door started again. I said, "Fuck it," and threw open the driver's side door, and there was another damn goose waddling away with all the speed it could manage, honking like a 5-year-old who just found the horn on his new bike. The pond I parked next to had a ton of them just dicking around. Needless to say, it was hard to sleep that night because every couple of minutes, the damn geese would peck at my door or land on the cab and waddle around. Trucker here. I think the best creepy thing that ever happened to me was when I was heading from Tucson, Arizona, up to Salt Lake City, Utah. A few years ago, the main highway had been taken out in a flash flood and was under construction. So I had to take a weird detour through the mountains in lower Utah. It was getting late, and I was getting tired, so I pulled off onto the shoulder and went to sleep in my bunk. This was in the middle of nowhere. The closest town was like 40 miles away, so it was completely pitch black outside once I turned the lights off. Anyway, around 4 a.m., I woke up because I heard something messing with my truck, like playing with the air and power cables between my cab and the trailer, which were literally 6 inches from where my head was but on the outside of the cab. Then I felt something climb onto the landing at the back of my truck, shaking the whole vehicle. I guessed it was something around 200 to 300 pounds climbing around back there, maybe a mountain lion or a bear. At this point, I was wide awake and wanted to get whatever it was away from me, so I slammed my hand into the cab wall, trying to scare it off, slamming hard enough to make a really loud noise. Then I heard someone, a male, scream bloody murder and fall off the back of my truck. Suddenly, I heard about 15 other people yelling all around my truck. I climbed up front, turned on my lights, and illuminated a squad of Army reserves doing their midnight ruck march and capture drills. It turned out these guys were supposed to find an abandoned truck and secure it for their midnight drills. That truck was 3 miles back down the road. They were not expecting me to be sleeping there and thought I was part of the drill. I'm ex-military, so after explaining I was not part of their test and was just there by coincidence, we laughed it off. They had to radio their CO and inform him I was there so the other squads wouldn't bother me. I used to work as a road train driver in the Gascoyne region of outback Western Australia. There was a lot of black dog phenomena on night shifts. I'd see all kinds of things appearing in the shadows because of fatigue. Sometimes 3 goats would seem to change into some sort of beast. One time, I swear I nearly ran over a corgi, which would be astronomically unlikely to find in the wild in this part of the outback. One night, I pulled over to sleep, let the engine run cold for 10 minutes, then tried to sleep. I woke up to noises. Not voices, but some sort of order to the noises, and the whole cab of the truck was shaking. I looked in the mirror and saw shadows around the vehicle. I turned the truck on, turned on every single light attached to it, and hastily continued my run to the port. This was a big cab, so it would have taken a lot to move it. I rationalized it as being caused by the wind, some goats around the truck, and fatigue. Either way, it scared the fuck out of me, and I never slept on night shift again. I used to deliver hotshot freight across the Great Plains and Minnesota area. One night around 2 a.m., I was hauling across North Dakota, trying to reach Montana by morning. I was delivering a particularly valuable tractor part that a farm desperately needed for the following day. I began to notice some highway hypnosis sneaking up on me, but it didn't really bother me because I'd been through it hundreds of times before. Anyone who has driven across North Dakota knows that it is incredibly flat, really flat. There also tend to be very straight and long roads, making it somewhat easy to see things on the road from far away, even at night. I noticed something long on the road, spanning my entire lane, approximately half a mile in front of me. I slowed down a little and prepared to move into the opposite lane, thinking it was some retread off a blown tire. As I got closer, I noticed it was 2 people, laying head to toe across the entire lane. I swerved into the other lane, successfully avoiding them, and came to an almost complete stop. But they didn't move, not an inch. I was just about to back up and check on them when I remembered a story that an old graybeard colleague of mine told me. He said that in certain remote areas, people will lie down in the middle of the road and wait for a car or truck to stop and see what's going on. At that point, the road layers, along with whoever else is hiding in the nearby bushes, will beat the driver and steal his vehicle, leaving him in the middle of nowhere. I decided not to back up, and when the 2 people on the road saw me put my truck back in gear and drive away, they both got up and walked toward the shoulder. I called the police and explained what happened, but we were so far from civilization that I doubt anything came of it. Thanks to that old graybeard, I got to keep my truck, my job, and my teeth. Parked off an exit ramp at about 3 a.m. for my 10-hour rest. The moon was full and high, and I spotted an unmistakably human figure in a nearby cut cornfield. It was a little spooky, but I wrote it off as an old-timer putting up a scarecrow for the grandkids. I started watching a few YouTube videos before turning in, and out of the corner of my vision, I thought I saw movement. I shut my lights off to get a good look, saw the figure, but nothing else. I couldn't be sure, but it looked like maybe it was in a different spot. Maybe a little closer, even. I was definitely feeling a bit spooked. The highway was devoid of anyone besides a car passing every 10 minutes or so. I didn't want to, but I had to jump out to pee. I considered a bottle, but I told myself I was being childish. I took a look at the figure, and it was right where I figured it should be. I hopped out, walked between my truck and trailer, and started peeing. Every fiber of my being wanted to look. I told myself again I was being foolish, but I couldn't help it. I looked out. The field was empty. The figure wasn't there. My stomach dropped. I pinched off and jumped back in. I took off down the highway, didn't care about a violation. Stopped 40 minutes up the road at a well-lit and very full Love's. Haven't stopped on a ramp since. Used to do deliveries, not actually a truck driver, though. I used to have this regular customer out in the boondocks, 25 miles or more out of the way of civilization and smack dab in the middle of two large towns. I would drive this route maybe once a month and would always pass at least one car driving towards me due to the sheer length of the drive. There was a small group of old houses on this route that were really broken down, and I had never seen anyone around them in 6+ months of driving the route. I always assumed they were vacant because they didn't look livable. Well, I was driving out to this customer one fall afternoon. I had been driving for a very long time without seeing a single car drive towards me. Finally, I drove past the abandoned houses, and there was one old lady in her front yard pushing an old manual grass cutter. But she stopped in her tracks as I drove towards her. I took it as a sign I was speeding or something and slowed down. I took a quick glance in my rearview mirror after passing by, and she was staring straight at me. She dropped the grass cutter and turned 180 degrees to do this. It was just very odd and definitely set off my spidey sense. I never saw her again or anyone else on that route by those houses in the 10 months I drove it. Driving through an abandoned section of Baltimore at 3 in the morning, my CB radio turned itself on and crackled for a bit. Out of nowhere, some voice over the radio said in a deep southern drawl, "I ain't got no panties on." I could see up and down the interstate for miles and saw not one set of headlights. Apparently, there was an older guy in Oklahoma City who went by the handle Bam Bam on CB Radio Channel 19 and had a recording of the "I ain't got no panties on" that would play every so often on his ridiculously illegally overpowered CB radio setup. Later, he had another creepy recording he'd play. He was infamous amongst truckers and amateur radio operators across the country because when atmospheric conditions were right, his signal would skip halfway around the country. His name was Klaus Kramer, and he got busted by the FCC at least twice and was fined $10,000. This was around 2001, and the docs of his FCC trouble are public. Driving through rural NM, in the Bisty area with its crazy melted rock look, was already an otherworldly experience. But add in a monsoon and it became downright surreal. The rain was coming down so hard it was like a deluge, making it difficult to see even at 20 miles per hour. Thunder and lightning rocked the car, sometimes turning into hail that pounded against everything. It was a nasty storm, to say the least. Then, rounding a corner, I was confronted with a scene straight out of a nightmare. The entire countryside was ablaze, flames reaching 20 feet high and stretching for hundreds of yards in all directions. And this wasn't just any fire. It was raging in the pouring rain, casting an eerie glow as dusk settled in. Rocks and dirt were wildly on fire amidst the downpour. I drove on slowly, feeling both freaked out and like I might be hallucinating. It was just so surreal. Later, I checked the news and learned the truth. A propane truck had slid off the road, going way too fast in the inclement weather. The impact must have been violent, causing the truck to burst open and ignite. I never saw the truck. It must have been hidden behind something. I felt a bit guilty afterward for not stopping, but in such a chaotic and dangerous situation, it's understandable that my priority was to keep moving. My dad used to drive a truck between Edinburgh and London, and he often recounts this story. One day, as he was driving down the motorway, he glanced to his right and saw a woman with a Miss Trunchbull bun, as he describes it, staring at him with a terrified expression from a car next to him. Before he could react, the car pulled off at the next exit, leaving my dad shaken but continuing on his journey. About half an hour later, a different car with a different driver pulled alongside my dad. But to his surprise, the same woman was in the passenger seat, wearing the same terrified expression. This unnerved my dad, and he decided to pull into the next services to report the incident, thinking it better to be safe than sorry. However, the car disappeared before he could gather any details, such as the license plates. He felt there was no point in calling the police without any concrete information, so he continued driving. Almost 4 hours later, nearing London, yet another car pulled alongside my dad, and to his horror, the same woman with the Miss Trunchbull hair and terrified expression was there, this time seemingly screaming at him through the window. Concerned, my dad pulled over into a lobby and immediately called the police. Apparently, they had received 3 other calls about the same woman and car in the same area in the last few minutes. Unfortunately, the story ends anticlimactically as my dad never heard anything more about it. Despite keeping an eye on the news, there was no mention of the incident. Hopefully, it was just a bizarre coincidence, but the whole ordeal left my dad unsettled. Who knows what really happened? Around 2006, I was driving a flatbed truck and picked up a load of construction materials. Drywall, roofing, I don't remember exactly, but it was prepackaged in boxes. I remember having to use strap protectors on the load. This was in rural Tennessee, and while my memory is foggy now, I want to say it was between Memphis and Nashville, but closer to the intersection of the MS-AL-TN state lines. Since tarping was required, I strapped everything down, tarped the load, and left the shipper. About 5 miles down the road, in the middle of nowhere woods on a 2-lane road, I noticed my tarp flapping in the wind. I found a wide shoulder and pulled over to fix it. Realizing that I had done a shoddy job tarping the load, I decided to redo it on the side of the road. I undid all the bungee straps, dragged the tarps off, rolled them back up, climbed up on the load, and started unrolling the tarps again. As I was working, I noticed a guy walking down the same side of the road I was on, coming towards my truck. Initially, I didn't think much of it, but as he got closer, I began paying more attention to him than to tarping my load. I grabbed my winch bar and set it on the trailer where I was working, just in case. The guy finally reached me, and the first thing I noticed was his hair. It was like a mullet but patchy as heck. The next thing I noticed were his eyes, which seemed off. His clothes were dirty and not well maintained, with dirty white tennis shoes, one of which didn't have laces, and the tongue was noticeably out of place. He stopped by me, waited until I acknowledged him, and simply said, "I've got a long walk." I replied sympathetically, acknowledging the remoteness of our location, and he seemed to accept that. However, he then repeated himself, and I explained that I couldn't give him a ride due to insurance reasons. Apologizing for not being able to help, he seemed to understand, turned around, and left. As I finished up the tarp job, I noticed him walking away from my truck. But when I glanced over again, he had turned around and was heading back towards me, now seemingly talking on a cell phone, except he was talking to his hand. Feeling increasingly uneasy, I quickly finished up, climbed into my truck, locked the doors, and set the winch bar on the passenger seat. As I pulled out, he stared at me with a deadpan expression, which gave me the creeps. By the time I checked the mirror, he was nowhere to be seen. I was driving through eastern Washington on some state roads, and there were no rest stops or cities around. However, I knew the route well enough to be aware of these massive dirt areas every 40 miles where you could park safely away from the road. Deciding to call it a night, I closed my blinds and settled down to watch something on my phone. After roughly an hour, I heard someone try to open the driver's side door. Surprisingly, I hadn't heard any vehicles on the road the whole time I was parked. Feeling uneasy, I cautiously got up to peek out the curtains. As I looked out into the darkness through the driver's side window, I heard them try the passenger side door. Peeking down from the top of the curtain, I couldn't see anything, so I started the truck and turned on the lights. Feeling quite freaked out by now, I still didn't open the curtains fully but kept peeking through gaps. To my relief, there was nobody standing near either of my doors or parked within sight line. I took a deep breath and closed the sleeper curtains too, hoping it would somehow make things better. As I lay back down and tried to convince myself that it was just the wind causing the door-like sounds, it was fairly windy outside, and the terrain was flat, I heard what sounded like someone trying to pry open the vents on the sleeper. The door handle started clicking again, and the truck began shifting as if someone was climbing on it. I hit the little alarm button in the sleeper, hoping to spook them off, but it only added to the cacophony of noise. The door handles, fingers tapping on windows and chassis, and the hiss of air coming out of the suspension. Then suddenly, it all stopped. There were a few moments of eerie silence, with only the sound of my own breathing and my heart pounding, before I heard another truck approach and then drive by. I spent the next few hours on edge, waiting for whatever it was to come back, but it never did. In the morning, I couldn't find any footprints or damage to my truck, but on every window were tiny handprints, resembling those of a toddler, as if someone had licked their hand and stuck it to my window repeatedly. I used to drive a truck in northern Manitoba, where there's a road in the northeast that stretches for hours with very few vehicles passing by. This road is quite flat and straight in stretches, deep in the bush. One day, I saw something cross the road in the distance. It was very large, easily taller than the hood of my truck, but not long like a moose or elk, just tall. It disappeared into the bush, and as I drove by the spot, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Days later, I heard a tow truck driver describing on the radio his encounter with a similar creature, except he was much clearer. He had spotted Bigfoot. This guy went to some lengths to explain he didn't want people thinking he was crazy, but he was sure of what he saw. Curious, I asked an Aboriginal client of mine in a nearby community, and he said the elders spoke of them as commonly as they spoke of other animals. I don't know what I saw that day, but I'm certain it wasn't a bear, moose, deer, or elk. I just don't know what the hell it was. Years ago, I read a story about a guy who was riding with his truck driver father as a child. They were in the middle of nowhere, and as they approached, they saw a person lying in the road with no one else around, no cars, nothing. His dad blew the horn, but the person didn't move. He blew it again as they got closer, but still no response. Sensing danger, his dad instructed him to put his head down and cover his eyes. Then he ran the person over. When they looked back, they saw a bunch of people who were previously hiding, running out of the woods. The implication was that his dad knew it was a setup for a robbery or worse and wasn't willing to take any chances, especially with his child in the car. I have no idea if it's true, but I think about that story all the time. My uncle was driving between Great Falls and Helena around 3 a.m. With the highway quiet and desolate, he had his high beams on. In the distance, he spotted something crossing the median and initially assumed it was a deer. As he drew closer, he realized it was standing upright. Sensing something amiss, he slowed his approach to about 30 miles per hour. To his shock, he realized it was a man clad in blue coveralls with a pig's head. Not a mask, but an actual pig's head placed on his shoulder. Panic surged through him. Swerving into the left lane, he passed the bizarre figure. As he did, the pig head lunged at the truck. My uncle didn't stop to check if he'd managed to grab hold until he reached the safety of Helena. There, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Since that eerie encounter, whenever he travels that stretch of road, he doesn't slow down for anything. My great-uncle drove big trucks, and living in the middle of nowhere, he often encountered trash left on the road. Typically, he'd just plow through boxes or paper with his big truck and continue on. However, one day, as he approached a cardboard box, he suddenly felt the urge to swerve and avoid it. He maneuvered around the box safely and continued driving without incident. Curious, he glanced in his rearview mirror to see the box, only to witness a kindergarten-aged child popping out from it. The child nonchalantly headed back to their house as if nothing had happened. Not a truck driver myself, but I've spent the past 4 years driving every day and night for work. Once, in a fairly rural part of Mississippi between Clarksdale and Greenwood, the weather turned sour as I was leaving Clarksdale. I called my wife, informing her of the high wind advisories and possible tornado threats throughout the Delta. I promised to call her as soon as I reached a safe area again. Having already worked for 14 hours, I grabbed some dinner and coffee to stay alert. Driving through flat farmland at night for over 100 miles can be fatiguing and eerie, especially without inclement weather. About 30 miles into the journey, hail started bouncing off my truck. Being a Mississippi native, I knew hail in July meant a tornado was possible. I pulled off to the side in the middle of nowhere, with no lights or other cars in sight, to look for the storm or tornado. I rolled down the passenger window and shined a bright flashlight into the night. Seeing nothing, I turned to the driver's side and saw a man's face pressed against the glass, grinning from ear to ear. I screamed, and he vanished, quickly drove off. Our trucks have running cameras, so when I reached the first safe place to stop, I called my wife. I didn't mention the man or the hailstorm to avoid scaring her, but I checked the cameras. Strangely, the man never appeared on the front or rear cameras. I've always dismissed it as my imagination, but I avoid driving through the delta in the dark unless absolutely necessary.